Ambulance. I'm Bill Potter. I have the privilege to have founded CNS a long time ago, let's say 1989. I'm delighted today to welcome back Sig Hecker, who serves as the Distinguished Professor of Practice at CNS, along with a number of other posts. You can look on the slide there to see some of his other credentials. He hasn't listed the books that he's published and all of the things that he's done, but I think there's no one who has been more actively engaged in science diplomacy than Sig, and is particularly well positioned as the former long-term director of Los Alamos National Laboratory to tell us about Oppenheimer, the rest of the story. So I don't know exactly what Sig's going to talk about here. He mentioned that since this is being broadcast, he reserves all of the copyright in case there's a second filming on the subject matter. So please be attentive to that when you discuss the matter with your friends and family. Sig, I'm not going to say more about you. We look forward to your remarks, and I think we'll have a very lively discussion following. So it's great to have you back with us.
Thank you, Bill. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and all of you out there in virtual land. First of all, actually, sort of a bit of an apology, for the title slide here. But it's actually, it was a CNS news release when I wrote something about the Oppenheimer movie. And then my wife said, I like this. And so if my wife said she likes it, I thought I would go ahead and use it. So, of course, the film was quite remarkable. And when it premiered, back in July, it did really catch the world's interest. And to me, the most important thing of the film is really renewed the interest in things nuclear, which had died off now for several decades, and then it just brought it back to life. And of course, the way that Nolan put the film together, it sort of garnered a lot of emotions, different emotions from different people. And my view was, you can think whatever you want. The most important part of this is he made people think seriously about things nuclear. And I thought that's what was really important. But the movie is really about Oppenheimer. It's about Oppenheimer, the person, this brilliant and sort of tortured man. And yet, there's so much more, to that. And particularly, just if we look at the Manhattan Project itself, the focus is primarily on Los Alamos. But as you can see from here, it's much, much more than Los Alamos. And then what I thought I would do, because in the film, there were quite a few scenes that I then thought about in some detail. And having been associated with Los Alamos now, it will be next month that it was 59 years ago that I went there as a summer student. So it's a long, long time. And I thought there's so much more of this. And then that made me think, and those of you who are old enough will remember him, a guy by the name of Paul Harvey. And he was a radio personality in Chicago. He would do the news at noon. He'd give you the latest news, and then he would say, and now for the rest of the story. And the rest of the story was sort of the backstory to the news, the really interesting stuff. And so I thought, well, look, let me try to give you the backstory to a lot of these scenes that we saw in Oppenheimer. So part of the backstory is, it was Manhattan Project. We like to think back officially Einstein to Roosevelt letter. And those of you who've been in the nuclear business know that Einstein really didn't have much to do with this. His buddy Leo Szilard wrote the letter, but of course Einstein's signature was crucial. And then it was really the Brits, came across first and said, hey, I think we can build a bomb. Now that fission was discovered in Germany in 1938. And then finally, the U.S. did get around to it. And those are the organizations there in 1942 that played an important role. And then in 43, the real major action was Los Alamos for the design and building of the bomb, Oak Ridge, and that was mostly for the uranium portion, and Hanford for the plutonium. And then, of course, the test at the Trinity site in New Mexico. But this was a huge industrial enterprise. Some 500,000 people altogether were involved in one end of it or another. So at the peak, it had 125,000. Okay, then in order to build up to the rest of the story, just to remind you, and I know for most of you this is really old hat, but I do need to remind you there are two paths to the bomb, and they pursued both of those and then demonstrated, both of those in the Manhattan Project. So Mother Nature doesn't give you bomb fuel. And so they knew right from the beginning that one of the major challenges would be, how do you make the bomb fuel? Well, from uranium, you have to throw away most of what Mother Nature gives you. It only gives you 0.7% of uranium-235. That's the fissile isotope, the bomb fuel. So you have to throw most of the rest of the way, and that's done by this enrichment process. And they knew already, and certainly their calculations pointed them in the direction, if they rather simple device, what's called a gun assembly, if you take about 60 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, you bang it together fast, it blows up, it fissions. And then with plutonium, again, Mother Nature doesn't give you plutonium, you have to make it in reactors. Again, you start with the same stuff, uranium ore, depending on what kind of reactor, you can use it as it is, but you have to go ahead and make it fission to create the neutrons to make plutonium. And that was Trinity test and Nagasaki. So that was it. Now, the reason that I mention it is now I'm going to go into the movie. I thought this was pretty clever scene of Oppenheimer there with the two jars. Okay, the big jar, because I just told you it takes some 60 kilograms or so in order to make that gun assembly work. Plutonium is so much more effective, it only takes around 6 kilograms or so. And so that's why the big jar and the little jar. And then the way Nolan does this, they sort of keep track of how they're making the progress. In Tennessee for enrichment, at Hanford for plutonium, they're making this stuff. And of course, that's an enormous challenge to make enough of that by the time that they had said by July 1945, they wanted to be able to have this thing ready. Okay, so that's the uranium and plutonium story. And by the way, in the way the movie, they had it by December 1944, they had these things, almost full. And so when people ask me how accurate was the science in Oppenheimer in the film, what I usually answer is it's good enough. It was good enough. But it wasn't quite good enough. And these jars were nowhere close to full in December of 44. And I'm going to show you that. Okay, so now the science. Okay, so how is the science and what did Nolan decide to do to really bring attention to the excitement of the science? He focused on this, and that is the plutonium version. It turns out they found out when they got the first plutonium from Hanford, it had the sort of isotopic mix that did not make it good enough for that crude gun assembly. But there have been guys at Los Alamos already working on a different assembly, and that is this spherical implosion assembly where you put a lot of high explosive around the plutonium instead of a gun delivery. You have to do it much faster with the plutonium. And you take a spherical, essentially a ball in the center, and you go ahead and you compress that. Well, it turns out to do that, it took the sort of geniuses that they had at Los Alamos at the time, including people like Johnny von Neumann, who may have been the smartest man ever in the world, who came from Hungary and wound up helping out in the Manhattan Project. So they have this explosive lens assembly, and that's what they showed. And then Nolan sort of walked you down as to how the excitement of the plutonium and the sphere assembly actually worked. Okay, so that's not bad. However, if Nolan had talked to me before, I would say that wasn't the most exciting part and the most critical part. It was really important, but the more exciting part was the plutonium itself. And it's funny, of all the books written about the Manhattan Project and all the things, the least that's been covered is the plutonium story itself. There's hardly anything there. And yet, it's the part that was really important. And then, of course, to me, so I first handled plutonium. I told you I came to Los Alamos almost 59 years ago in June of 1965. About 2 weeks later, I was handling plutonium in a glove box at Los Alamos. And it turns out my neighbor at Los Alamos, later on, because I came back 3 different times, actually was there, and he cast the first parts of plutonium. His name was Ed Hamill. And so I said, Ed, write up the story. And he did in this book published by Los Alamos Laboratory called Plutonium Metallurgy at Los Alamos, 1943 to 45. So I'm going to take you through. So
Who's the author?
I'm sorry?
Who is the author?
Oh, Edward Hamill. Edward Hamill. He had just graduated from Princeton, PhD, came to Los Alamos, and that was his first job. So I'll walk you through this plutonium business. So first of all, look at the density. Okay, density, you take any metal, you measure the density, it's pretty straightforward. Well, when they measured the density at Chicago first, which the first plutonium work done at Los Alamos, it was all over the map, varying by a factor of 2, and they're going to design this bomb. And you can't have the density vary by a factor of 2. You don't know how big you're going to make this thing. So this was a disaster. It was, incredible. And look at the timelines, 43, 44, and so forth. But then what was even just as challenging is Ed Hamill put this together. This he called the delivery curve. In other words, how much plutonium did they get at Los Alamos during those years? Okay. This is kilograms on the left. And mind you, need 6 kilograms or so for the bomb. And it's down on the bottom. And then finally, by 1945, you start getting, tens of grams, then half a kilogram by May timeframe. And you don't get enough until so close to the Trinity test. I mean, it was just totally incredible. So this by itself was this enormous challenge. Are you going to be able to make enough plutonium? But that was still not the biggest challenge. The biggest challenge was that plutonium was almost impossible. And if you think about it, humankind didn't discover plutonium until 1941. It turns out Mother Nature makes it in a big bang, and actually in Africa, at a place called the Oklo Natural Reactor, Mother Nature made plutonium itself. But the half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years, and so it goes away if you're talking about a couple of billion years. There's nothing left. So you have to recreate it. These guys did at Berkeley, Glenn Seaborg and company, and first in a cyclotron, and there they made specks. Okay, specks, little bits of dust almost. And then Enrico Fermi and company made it in Chicago under Stagg Field, the first reactor that was built. So you start making grams worth of this stuff. But it wasn't discovered, until a couple of years before the Manhattan Project. And now they were going to try to build something out of it. Okay, so here you have the delivery curve, and I'm going to walk you through. So by early 1944, as they played with this stuff and were able to reduce enough to make metal from the stuff that comes from the reactor, from the spent fuel from the reactor, you have to go ahead and chemically process that and get the metal. And so in the first experiments on that, they found out this stuff has 5 different lives, 5 phases, 5 crystallographic versions of plutonium. And it turns out they have the world's best crystallographer, Willie Zachariasen, who came from Norway, settled in the United States. He was University of Chicago. I met him many times when he was at Los Alamos. So they have 5 phases. They reduced the metal successfully. And then in July of 44 is when they made this implosion decision. Okay, we got to get serious. We're going to have to make this in a bowl. And then they start measuring other physical properties, by August. And they said, okay, the pure plutonium is essentially impossible to work with. It has these 5 phases. It goes back and forth. The room temperature phase is more like a mineral than a metal. It's brittle as can be. We're not going to be able to make anything out of it. But they also happen to have this guy, Cyril Stanley Smith, who was one of the world's best metallurgists, a Brit, who came and he was working for American Brass Company, came to the Manhattan Project, and he says, brass, bronze, all of those things, you take copper, you mix something with it, and you make something else. So maybe if we mix something with the plutonium, it'll behave better. And that's called alloying for the metallurgists. And so they started an alloy survey program. Let's see what we can put in to see whether we can retain a better metal, version of plutonium. My neighbor, Ed Hamill, told me, so I said, okay, how did you think this through? He said, well, the way we thought it through, we went to the storehouse and see what they had, and we added that in. And we just went through everything that they had there. And so they found out, essentially by 1945, aluminum works. Okay, we put aluminum in, and we retain one of the friendly versions of plutonium. So let's do that. Physicist, this is a metallurgist. Physicists, no, you can't use aluminum. That's really bad stuff. You can't have light elements in conjunction with the plutonium because plutonium is alpha radioactive. These alpha particles go hit the light elements and they make neutrons. And you can't have neutrons because this thing isn't going to work right. So then they go on in silicon. Okay, that's a little heavier. It looks better, but that's also not good enough. Finally, in May, they say, okay, go down the periodic table from aluminum, you go down to gallium. Gallium is quite a bit heavier. You're not going to knock out a lot of neutrons. Gallium works. Okay, so that was good. But now, remember, we're in May, and they want this thing by July. So there's a really cute story from Cyril Stanley Smith. He said, okay, we found out that gallium works. Oppenheimer is the boss. And again, Nolan could have done all of this. And they go to Edith Warner's restaurant down by the Rio Grande. Smith goes and sees Oppenheimer down there, and he tells Oppenheimer the story, and he says, hey, look, we found out that gallium works. So what do you think we should use? And Oppenheimer turns to Smith and he says, you decide. That's exactly, they're good manager, it's the technical person that ought to decide. He chooses gallium. Now we're getting close to June, almost June timeframe. It isn't until June that they choose the gallium and then go ahead and now instead of specks, they cast, parts that are kilograms. And they do all of that, take it down to Trinity. But one more problem. And again, this would have been a great Nolan moment. The plutonium by itself, you have to coat it. Because among other things, plutonium oxidizes like crazy. I mean, much, much worse than iron. And you can't have this thing oxidizing, while you're trying to get it ready for a test. So you coat it. So you nickel coat it. Well, it turns out Cyril Stanley Smith rides down with the plutonium. They get it done. And the day at noon, the day before, at the McDonald Ranch, the day before July 16th, this thing develops a blister. Right. So he's down there with this. He looks at it. It's got a blister. Physicist says you can't have a blister. The symmetry of the implosion isn't going to be right. And so Cyril Stanley Smith is there with a hypodermic needle, and he somehow fixes this blister. And here's Cyril Stanley Smith, as he said some years later, at approximately noon the day before, And he says, my fingers were the last to touch those pretentious bits of warm metal. The feeling remains with me to this day. 36 years later is when he said that. It's incredible. What a story. And then Oppenheimer, and I didn't see this until I started doing research on Oppenheimer after the movie, as the movie was about to come out. I didn't do any research on Oppenheimer before. But then I found out he actually gave this interview on plutonium. He said it turned out not to be a cozy metal. They got different density. He said it was terrible test from the beginning. It never stayed quiet. It gets hot. It's radioactive. You can't touch it. You have to coat it. And the coating always peels, as it did just before that. He said it's a terrible substance all the way. That was Oppenheimer. Okay, just if you bear with me just another minute or two, just to give you the whole plutonium story and tell you why I think it's so exciting. By far the most complex element in the periodic table. So it sits down here, in what we call the actinide series of the periodic table. And here is plutonium 94. It has 94 electrons, 92 protons. That's the atomic number. Uranium is just a few up. So these are all the things that the physicists care about, the protons and neutrons. And these things down here, they're down on the bottom end of the periodic table. They're heavy. They have lots of extra neutrons. They split easily, and that's how you can make them fission. So that's why plutonium is of interest. But what really makes plutonium so exciting and complicated, and not those neutrons and protons in the nuclear structure, it's the electronic structure. And most of the elements that you worry about, from aluminum to copper to anything else, it's the electronic structure that governs the key properties. And so by the time you get down to the periodic table, you get peculiar electrons and electron orbitals into play. And if it's one thing you keep in mind of plutonium, just sort of remember this diagram. And this diagram, it goes across the periodic table, and it shows you what are the crystal phases as you move across and you alloy, you mix these things together. And then what are the actual crystal structures? FCC means face-centered cubic, BCC means body-centered cubic, and then things melt. So as you go across the actinides, instead of the melting points increasing, which is what usually happens as you go across the other tables, it decreases. So there's something strange about these materials. And then as you move across the periodic table, they go from cubic. Again, cubic is nice, it's symmetric, it's got nice properties. Then it becomes less symmetric, tetragonal, orthorhombic, complex cubic, tetragonal and orthorhombic. So you get more and more complicated crystal structure. It means more and more complicated behavior. And then it all comes right to a climax at plutonium. Okay, you have monoclinics. That's really a bad crystal structure. And you have 6 phases. Manhattan Project, they thought they had 5. It took another decade before they found a very small temperature part of one of the phases. So plutonium is it's right there where everything changes from one type of behavior to another type of behavior. That's what makes it so complex. And so a lot of the weapons work being done today is not only do you have those properties in plutonium, but the stuff changes, it ages. Of course, it oxidizes from the outside in, but plutonium changes from the inside out because it's radioactive. It destroys those crystal structures. And we never worried much about that in the past. Usually a weapon system it was designed for about 10, 15 years, and that was it. Okay, now the last time we tested was more than 30 years ago. Okay, so that's a long aside, isn't it, for the science of why plutonium would have, and he could have told such a much better than I. Okay, so next is the uniform. The uniform, right? This is from the movie. So this was I Robbie, and of course this Cillian Murphy is Oppenheimer. And he's there with the uniform because he was told, by Groves, that they're all going to have to wear a uniform. After all, they're in this super secret project, out in this place called Los Alamos. They got to wear a uniform. Well, as it turns out then, so did this actually happened? Did he ever wear a uniform? And the best that I can tell, that includes Charles Oppenheimer weighing in, he never wore a uniform. However, Groves told him he'd have to wear one. Oppenheimer, he was going to do this project and he was ready to wear a uniform. They said he actually went to the Presidio in San Francisco to begin enlistment, and he ordered the uniform. But I'm going to leave it to people like Avner Cohen, who can do history like I can't do, to actually say, is that really true? But from what I'm told is they don't think he ever wore a uniform. And what really happened, and here the history is quite clear. Robert Bacher, who's the guy on the left, he was a major physicist at that time back at Lincoln Labs at MIT. And then I. Rabi, again, super physicist, Nobel laureate, et cetera. They just said, we're not coming to Los Alamos. We're not going to wear a uniform. Bacher actually said, look, if the government drafts me, they want to put me in uniform and send me into war, I'm ready to serve. But I'm not willing to do this because science can't flourish in a rigid military structure. So then the movie, and again, this is Nolan's genius, as far as I'm concerned, of getting all of this story across by just putting the uniform on him. And it's not what happened, but it gets the whole message across. He takes the uniform off, puts on his pork pie hat, and walks out. Okay. So now what's the rest of the story? And Nolan never tells that. And again, this is it's a long rest of the story, but it's fantastic and it's crucial to American history of science and technology. It's crucial. And what they did is the way they solved this problem, and Nolan never mentions, into the University of California. And so Groves, through various connections, goes to the University of California, which of course at that time is running, the Berkeley laboratory, and he convinces them to sign a contract that the University of California is going to manage this laboratory. Okay, they agree to furnish necessary personnel, supplies, materials, equipment. This is mostly due, for the laboratory part, the design part. University personnel rules and regulations, not military, as well as general operating procedures would apply at the lab. And then, actually, interestingly enough, Oppenheimer, long after the war, when he was asked about the University of California, he made this statement, and he said, the contractor during the war years was extremely helpful, an able contractor. Was really distinguished primarily by his absence. Now, the reason they were distinguished by their absence is they signed this contract. They didn't know where Los Alamos was or what Los Alamos did. They went ahead and signed this contract, which is just really remarkable. But the rest of the story is this gave birth to a good part of the American scientific capabilities in the future. And in fact, this model, the GOCO, it's called, government-owned, contractor-operated, it was such a novel concept. And then to bring it to do the government's business, so the government owned the land at Los Alamos, and at Chicago, Argonne University, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and all of those. So this model allowed sort of the freedom of inquiry. You were still doing the government's work, but you were able to get the best and the brightest into these laboratories to do the science. And in fact, it was the birth of, you've all heard of the DOE laboratories, the various national laboratories that I just mentioned. Today, there are 17 of those laboratories. And for a long time, they were all run by this GOCO concept. Now, a few years ago, while I was director, although I had nothing to do with the writing of publication of this book, my colleagues, Lillian Hoddeson, Avner, you may know of her. She was a historian and the lab historian, also Roger Mead, worked on this. And they called the book The Critical Assembly. And they weren't talking about fissile materials critical assembly. They were talking about critical assembly of people. And what did that mean to have the critical assembly of that kind of talent together in one place? And what they showed is, hey, look, the Manhattan Project, it was a whole new way. Big science, theory, computation, experiment, innovative management model, government funding now scientific research, much different than earlier, than the 20th century. And then what they demonstrated, the effective incorporation of foreign scientific talent, even into the most sensitive of things for the nation. I went back just, I thought, well, I knew, the US was not the paragon of science in the first half of the 20th century, particularly not of physics. So I looked at the Nobel Prizes, and as you can see, from 1900 to 45, physics 6 out of the 45, chemistry 3. And look after 1945, 62 in physics and 41 in chemistry. Clearly, there was a phase change in the United States. And then on, from 1909, next 30 years, you can see again. So this whole structure, this way of doing business, the Manhattan Project was the way into that world. And that's part of the rest of the story. It certainly wasn't there. Okay, let me go on. This has sort of more general interest, and I thought was also, it was so clever from Nolan. So here they are, Einstein and Oppenheimer at the pond at Princeton. And there are 3 scenes like that in the movie. And at least from what, none of those happened. Of course, they didn't know each other because Oppenheimer, went to Princeton, was head of the institute there at Princeton. And they certainly met and they talked and knew each other. Again, Nolan was clever enough to say he has Oppenheimer going to see Einstein and bringing some calculations about the possibility that this bomb could essentially light up the atmosphere. It could destroy the whole world. And it didn't happen. Oppenheimer did. There was this controversy back at Los Alamos. Edward Teller was claiming, that distinct possibility. Hans Bethe, who was another one of the Nobel physics laureates at Los Alamos, from Germany, who came here, Hans Bethe said, no, it isn't going to happen. He got his Nobel Prize for discovering how the fusion on the sun works, so he knew something about these things. Bethe said no, Einstein was still, and Oppenheimer actually goes somewhere, but he goes to Chicago to talk to Arthur Holly Compton, who's one of the American Nobel laureates, and he asked him the question. He didn't ask Einstein. But if he has, in the movie, if he hasn't go see Compton in Chicago, that's nothing. If he hasn't go see Einstein in the movie, it tells the whole story. So he goes and sees Einstein. And so then he also, Einstein at one point asks Oppenheimer, he says, remember when you invited me in 1939 to Berkeley? And you were going to give me a prize at Berkeley. And Oppenheimer says, yes. And he says, because you thought that I no longer understood what I had created. Right? And again, to work for Nolan to work that in. And of course, that was a lot of concern about Einstein. He did all those great things. By this time, was he really at the top of the world? So he said that. And so he said, so you gave me this award. And these are Nolan's words now. You gave me this award. He said, but just, that award, it was not for me. It was for all of you. If you think about that, right, you get an award. Sometimes the award actually means more to those people giving the award than the person who's going to get the award. That's the message that he gets across here. And Oppenheimer, sort of nods at that particular time. But then he goes and talks to Einstein again. And so this time Einstein says, and then someday when you'll have to live up with what you've created, He says, and then when they've punished you enough, they'll serve you salmon and potato salad. They'll make speeches. They give you a medal. They pat you on the back. And they tell you all is forgiven. Just remember, it won't be for you. It'll be for them. And it turns out at that point, he actually brings up the Fermi Award ceremony. And there's Teller, there's E.O. Lawrence, and all of these others. Just remember, it's not for you. It's for them. And again, what a clever way to bring all of that across. And then, of course, in terms of punishment, this is what happened, and much of the movie focused on the issue of Oppenheimer's security suspension and the personalities involved. Lewis, I have a hard time calling him Strauss, which is what he said. For me, it's Strauss, but that's okay. And then, of course, there's Edward Teller. And later in the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk more about Edward Teller, because actually I never met Oppenheimer. He died in 1967. I came to Los Alamos 65 as a summer student, and I came back as a postdoc in 68. He had come back a couple of times to Los Alamos, Oppenheimer did, but I did not meet him. But Edward Teller, I've met numerous times. And if you talk about complex personalities or troubled personality, Edward Teller certainly fit that. Okay, so then redemption. So here it came, and this is the actual scene from the Fermi Award ceremony. It was really President John F. Kennedy that had signed the fact that Oppenheimer would get the Fermi Award. But he was dead by this time, and it was Lyndon Johnson. That was there in 1963. By the way, Bill, I think this is Charles Oppenheimer's father, Peter Oppenheimer. And the reason that I mention that is look at Oppenheimer's face. As troubled as he was by this time, this is 1963, Charles Oppenheimer told me that Peter, who was there, his son, said that this was really meaningful to Oppenheimer. He really did care about getting the Fermi Medal. They had asked him, Kennedy had asked whether he wanted to do something about that decision in 1954, and Oppenheimer said no. So they decided, at that time, give him the Fermi Award, and it really was important to Oppenheimer.
So this was after Kennedy was assassinated, the actual reward.
And then, from that point on, from 1954, then the Fermi Award, and at Los Alamos, numerous people had tried to set things right about the 1954 decision. By the time it came to my time to do something right, in 2016, when my good colleague Ernie Moniz was Secretary of Energy, there are a number of us who wrote letters and said, look, it's time to make this right. And Secretary Moniz, at the strong advice of his legal team, said no. They said, no, you can't do this. And then, as it turns out, back in 2022, there was another effort. A Senate staffer, Tim Reeser, took up the effort, and actually there were a number of us, sort of all living former Los Alamos directors, wrote a letter together that was penned mostly by the current director, Tom Mason, expressing our views, that things should be done right at this point. When I wrote my letter, the first letter, I worked in, all of the things like, I came to this country, my country trusted me, and all these things, they're so important, but it didn't go anywhere. But anyway, this one did, and to some extent, and Charles Oppenheimer, when he was here, he gave a talk here, Oppenheimer on Oppenheimer, which I thought was beautiful done, especially giving sort of a family view of things. And he explained, in addition to the fact that Secretary Granholm really had the guts to go after this, but also the smarts. She got a lawyer who figured out that you can't get that decision reversed. What you do is you say the process is what was bad, and that's what allowed them to vacate the decision. So that decision was vacated, and as Charles said, the family was really very much gratified by that. Okay, let's see, how am I doing as far as time? Maybe
Another.
I'll
5 minutes or
do, I'll do at least one more, sort of going back and saying the rest of the story. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and of course, when Charles Oppenheimer was here, Masako, you and I also said a few words, right, at that point. And of course, a lot of people will say he didn't show Hiroshima, he didn't show Nagasaki. He decided not to go there. Instead, there's sort of the one scene, the description of what happened there, and then one of Los Alamos scientists going out and throwing up after he'd heard what happened. That's sort of Nolan's mind sort of captured it. He didn't want to go there for the rest of it for, whatever his reasons were. But, I use these things, and this is Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Richard Rhodes is a very good colleague of mine. Actually, Avner, you'll be interested. I just got an email from him the other day. He's up in Seattle these days. He's giving a big talk at Yale this week, and he was checking something with me. So at any rate, I mean, he in that really great book, he said maybe mankind realized its own mortality, and of course, Oppenheimer and Niels Bohr were playing very much with those concepts. The whole concept is this bomb going to be so bad that it may be the last of the new innovations used in war, and maybe there will be no more wars. But, as you know, and there's Tokyo on the left, that's firebombing, very similar destruction, and Hiroshima on the right. But what's different about the atomic bombs, and here's the Enola Gay, is Hiroshima, it was one B-29, not 300 some B-29s, not tens of thousands of bombs, but one bomb, one plane, one city destroyed. That's what the difference of the atomic bomb. And there are many quotes from Oppenheimer. The one that I like the best by far, that he said later on, I think by 1946 or so, that the atomic bomb made the prospect of future war unendurable. It's led us up the last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond there is a different country. And then I take that and go off and said, beyond there's a different world. And indeed, so Nolan also, tried to then capture the different world. And so he has Oppenheimer again with Einstein at the pot. And he says to Einstein, do you remember when I came to you with these calculations about perhaps igniting the atmosphere and ending life as we know it and destroying the world? And Einstein says, I remember it well. What of it? And Oppenheimer's reply is, I believe we did. And then, of course, there was the end, the missiles in the silos. You see the streaks going up, and then you see the rings of fire and the world destroyed. Okay, so that's the way the movie ended. And so my view then on the rest of the story, but that's not what happened. Okay, and this was August 1945. That's not what happened. What happened, I like to catch in this diagram, is number of deaths in war as a function of time. And what that shows is, for several centuries now, every time mankind was able to essentially invent a new type of weapon and use it in war, they used it and they killed each other better. Time after time after time. And that's all the way into the 20th century, World War I and World War II. And you look at the number of people killed. Okay, we're not talking about 30,000. We're talking about 87 million. That growth is exponential. It was going out of sight. And 1945, it drops precipitously. And if you look at today's statistics, of course, there's still some million people killed around the world. This is not a peaceful world. But we have not gone back, to that exponential growth. So there was something. And then particularly, we all try to understand we have different views of, no nuclear weapons have been used in war. So we haven't gotten to that Armageddon yet. But certainly we know that it's there. And then, particularly, so what Oppenheimer then had hoped to shape is not to get into the arms race. He talked about the fact that we ought to have international control. Again, these are ideas of Niels Bohr and his own. And he was concerned about the arms race. But indeed, what happened was the arms race, after 1945. And if you just look at this, these are the type of nuclear devices that the United States built sort of in the next, 10 years time frame. It was just incredible. And I look at that now and you can't conclude anything, but this is crazy. I mean, artillery shell, a backpack nuke, all of those things. I also like to think about this when I think about new countries like North Korea developing nuclear weapons. North Korea now is trying to fit nuclear weapons into all these different types of missiles. That's crazy. Well, we did it. And then, of course, what was even more so, and that's what Oppenheimer really worried about, was the hydrogen bomb, because Teller and company had been working on that already during the Manhattan Project. And so the combination of those, they really worried about. And then, of course, that one was pretty big, 10 megatons. But it was nothing compared to the big one, that the Russians developed. And here I am standing with one of the designers. He was a colleague of Sakharov's, of the big one, that they detonated at 50 megatons, half of the design yield in the bioassembly in 1961. So you put all of that together, and we clearly have developed the capabilities to destroy each other, but we have not. And with that, let me just mention this briefly, and then we'll turn to discussion. So this international control and Oppenheimer's view that it was crucial really came out in this Aitchison-Lilienthal report, where he was the chief scientific advisor, which was convened shortly after the end of World War II. The things I want you to take away is they already realized then, 1946, that the incentive for other countries to build nuclear bombs is going to be overwhelming. And then really importantly, and this is the whole non-proliferation world, is the technologies are interchangeable and interdependent. So if you're going to do nuclear power, you're going to have some of those capabilities. And so they said the only way out of this is international control. They worried about nuclear proliferation. And indeed, if you looked at those sort of post-war years, these are all of the countries that one time had tried, like Sweden, Switzerland, which you wouldn't expect, but they did. And Abner, the reason that Israel is a different color is because you say one thing, the American government says another thing. The official American government policy is we do not know whether Israel has nuclear weapons or not. So I stick to that, but I read Avner's books also. And then, of course, there were the P5, and then India, Pakistan, North Korea, South Korea gave it up. But certainly, enough countries tried. But then I do want to say this also. And then as we get into the world, particularly that Bill Potter has watched for us for decades now, the whole non-proliferation treaty and all of that, I have to give Eisenhower credit for getting us in that direction. So Oppenheimer argued for international control, but I was actually quite surprised when I read much of his early work that in the early years he was not in favor of nuclear energy. He basically concluded that's not what countries need right now. I mean, they need something to eat. They need to reconstitute. Nuclear energy takes a long time. It was Eisenhower at one time after Oppenheimer briefed him, who said, I think we have to give people hope. Not just have them work against doing the bad things, but also making sure we can do the good things. And so he said, we have to share the nuclear technologies. And his speech is one of the most beautifully written speeches I've ever seen. And I thought, of course, he had a speechwriter. But Susan Eisenhower, his granddaughter, I'm sure, Bill, you know her, and I know her, actually told me that when Eisenhower, for this speech, when he was flying in the helicopter from Washington up to New York, he took another couple of passes around. He told the pilot, I'm not finished on my speech yet. And those words, are just beautiful words. And it took that, to finally get to things like the IAEA, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then this, I will leave it here. This is when 1986, when I became director of Los Alamos. And it wasn't until a few years later that we were able to do many of the things that Oppenheimer had hoped we could do in terms of working with the enemy, so to speak. And that was my first year. Budget balancing act, Challenger blew up, one wholly spy disaster, Chernobyl blew up. Gorbachev, Reagan get together, say, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. And then I'll show this. It was my turn. That was my official director photo in 1986. Okay, thank you. I'm going to leave it there.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Sig. That was marvelous. I think we do have at least a couple of additional movies to make based upon the items that you raised. I have a host of questions that I'd like to ask. I'm going to try to hold off for a moment and let others who wish to speak to do so. So let me ask, first of all, is there anybody around the room who has a question that they'd like to lead off with? Well, let me do that. And if you can just, rather than read them, if you can just let me know who is on the line there, who may want to speak, that would be also good. Let me put a couple of questions out for general discussion, and there are some people in the virtual audience who may wish to comment on this. And not all of these topics are kind of directly related to Oppenheimer, but I think they're important issues, for us, to consider. I'm kind of curious, Sig. I was not aware of some of the difficulties that you identified in terms of the actual, production of plutonium at the very end of the, period prior to the test. And I'm curious, given your focus also on and familiarity with the Soviet, process, the degree to which they encountered any similar difficulties and the degree to which they were able to avoid those difficulties because of Fuchs in particular. I just don't know the answer to that, so I'm kind of curious. I also think it would be really interesting for us to have a discussion at some point, maybe now, maybe not, regarding the issue of the UC oversight of the labs and the implications of the change in policy in 2005 for the, what's the word I want to use? I don't know, productivity may not be the right word, but I know that a number of the offices within the labs changed rather significantly. I mean, the one that I was most familiar with was the Z division, having worked at UCLA before and having been a consultant over an extended period, and that this is their intelligence branch at Livermore. And while I only worked in the open source domain, I was so impressed early on with the diversity of people there, the different, it was a multidisciplinary body with political scientists, historians, the physicists, sociologists. I mean, I saw Amy Sands was on the line here. She was part of that group in the past. And so I'm kind of curious about the impact of that oversight on the functioning of the lab. And I see Jerry Brown is with us as well, and he may have some views about, the virtues of the old way of doing things and the new way. But I think it would be quite interesting in terms of how that managerial change impacted upon innovation, within the labs. So those are some comments. But I don't want to redirect the discussion if others wish to also weigh in at this time. But as we wait maybe for input, and those of you on the line, if you want to kind of indicate to me, if you want to raise a hand, if you want to weigh in, by all means, do so. But Sid, you want to respond to some of these points, and then others? I really want to have as free-wheeling a conversation as possible.
No, these both of those are very important, but I didn't have time to really delve into this. The UC issue, University of California issue, I've written about that, and of course I experienced that. And what you say is absolutely right, except it was worse than that. And so this incredibly innovative concept, of trying to get smart people into sort of an academic, almost like environment, but still having a product and doing something for the lab. But how do you get the smartest people? Well, that took a lot of doing, and it took that sort of contract. And for what it's worth, I mean, I went to Los Alamos because at that time it says operated by the University of California. That's why I went. I was going to be a college professor. That's what I wanted to do in life. And so Los Alamos was just a stop on the way. And how can I lose? You got all these smart people there. So that was really important. And even though one of my predecessors, Harold Agnew, who was number 3 director, I was the 5th director, he'd already complained enormously when the Atomic Energy Commission changed over to something called ERDA, Energy Research and Development Authority, to eventually the Department of Energy. This was 1977 for DOE. He said things had already gone to pots by then. But things were still pretty good. And so I was there at the lab at the time, but then I became director in 86, and things were still not so bad. But then what happened is when the Cold War ended, sort of our freedom ended in a way. And before the Cold War ended, and particularly what I'm talking about is sort of freedom from congressional interference. And we had much more of a carte blanche from Congress in those days because they know they needed us against those big bad Soviets. And so they needed us so they wouldn't put all the screws on us, which they tend to do in almost every other organization that the government runs. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, that was the beginning then of the change. And so they kept on sort of, hitting the University of California. You got to do more to control these labs. You got to incentivize their directors. Here I am as director of this laboratory, essentially making peanuts compared to our friends up here in San Francisco. And they're talking about incentivize. I'm doing this for my country. And so that got worse and worse, that by 2005, when the government actually decided it was no longer just going to renew the UC contract. It was going to compete, including to commercial consortium, for-profit consortium. That's when I decided I'm out of here. And so after 34 years at the laboratory, I officially retired and I went to Stanford on my way to Monterey. Okay, so that's really crucial. If anybody's really interested, I wrote a paper as I was going out in 1987 about essentially the death of the GoCo concept as to what happened. Just a brief answer to the Soviets. There's so many fascinating interactions, and certainly in terms of the Soviet nuclear program and the speed at which they were able to do that. Essentially what my Soviet colleagues, Russian colleagues then said at that time, it helped, it saved them time. And actually most of the time saving was much more so, not from any of the scientific knowledge or discovery, but just the industrial processes and the things that you did. The blind alleys that we might have taken, that it would take us months, to get there, that sort of information and knowledge was helpful. In terms of the science themselves, the science itself, what Yuli Khariton told me, he was what we call the Russian Oppenheimer. He says, hey, look, we knew all of that. You know, fission was discovered in 1938. The big meetings took place here when Bohr came over in 1939 to bring that information to the Americans. And he said, by that time, we in Russia, he said, I myself, you know, Yuri Hariton and Zeldovich, we wrote two papers in 1939. You know, one was fission for nuclear energy. The second one was fission for nuclear bombs. And he said, so we knew this stuff. But of course, they didn't have the industrial capacity. You know, Hitler was, you know, going into Russia. On the plutonium, I spent a good part of the post-Soviet years working with my Russian colleagues. So they had a Cyril Stanley Smith-like guy. His name was Butchva. And he was one of the great metallurgists of the 20th century. And he's the guy who was working the plutonium issues. And so most of that stuff they did themselves. And then they had sort of my equivalent, you know, plutonium metallurgist, and her name was Lydia Timofeeva. And she and I have written papers together. We continue to try to understand that. I held annual workshops on plutonium science for about 12 years with the Russians, trying to understand this incredibly complex, enigmatic material. I see that Governor Brown is there. You know, I hosted Governor Brown at Los Alamos when I was division leader, and I was in charge of all the plutonium-related work. So that was doing Governor Brown the first. Nice to see.
Governor, you want to take the floor and comment or respond to anything that's been said so far? I think you're muted at the moment.
Very interesting, very informative. Yeah, I do remember that. And I will say the university is a two-edged sword. I believe it's the case that during the Carter administration, when there was an attempt to get a comprehensive test ban, that the lab directors were lobbying against the president. So their freedom to disagree with the presidential policy was a function of their being at the university. So in that case, to the extent it retarded getting to the comprehensive test ban, which still don't really have, at least not ratified, I think that was problematic. Secondly, the idea, I mean, it's all very exciting to watch, and I'm aware of that general idea that killings are going down. Steven Pinker wrote a couple of books on this. Some people have termed his work happy time history. It's all happy. Well, it's true. There's not as many being killed unless we have a third world war. But the capacity, the 12, 13,000 nuclear weapons, and probably more to come. If we do have the blunder that Bill Perry worries about, if we do have some negative outcomes, I mean, the fact, or a negative future that we're hoping not to have, but the fact that nothing's happened since Nagasaki in terms of a bomb being asked, that doesn't prove that the bomb is going to protect us forever. It's happened. There's a fallacy called post hoc, ergo propter hoc. That means after something provides the reason for why something happened. But no, time passed. We haven't had the bomb yet. We haven't had it being used. But the horror is there. And the cleverness demonstrated at Los Alamos at a very basic level is completely impressive. But on the other hand, there's a certain obscenity in this power, this kind of, what would I say? We're taking fire from the gods, as it were, like Prometheus, and we could blow ourselves up or kill billions. And in the face of the excitement of this presentation, that's replicated by conversations all over. And I've been, year I left the governorship, I went down to Los Alamos and got a 7, 8 hour briefing. And I got the talk at the end from Brad Roberts, what I call the cheerleading for the use of nuclear, the value of nuclear weapons. So all of that optimism is still in the face of a physical reality that human beings since 45 have developed a capacity of superhuman slaughter, catastrophe, and I would say apocalypse. And my feeling, and I'm not a scientist, I'm just a guy who spent 50 years talking to a bunch of politicians. I don't have confidence in the political wisdom of those who lead us. I don't. Based on my life, I've thought about it. I don't have confidence maybe myself to do this. So what I'm saying is we got a tragedy here. It hasn't fully unfolded. Wonderful if it keeps going. But most people think, and I'd say Nunn, Kissinger, Perry, and Schultz certainly thought we had to do something to get a much bigger control on our nuclear weapons. Well, since the time that those four wrote in that vein, we're going backwards. We're not going forward. And we are heavily engaged and in an interactive relationship of escalating threats under the rubric of deterrence. And it's not just Russia against us, it's Russia, America interacting, reacting, being shaped by. Now it's emerging with China similarly. And the Congressional Commission has laid out the rationale for real escalation to deal with the peer competitor in nuclear weaponry of China. So all to be said is it's an amazing human story that this bomb. But I think one thing that Oppenheimer did say, and I haven't been able to run down the source, but it was quoted in a letter to the regents by Gregory Bateson, who was there with Johnny von Neumann at the Macy Conference, and Heinz Forrester and Norbert Wiener and others that really looked into cybernetics and feedback, things that an information theory that led right into the creation, made possible, at least in part, the nuclear bomb. But Bateson quotes Oppenheimer as saying, the world is headed to hell at an increasing rate of speed with a positive rate of change. And Bateson said that he didn't see how an arms race had more than two outcomes, the nuclear arms race. Either one, we destroy ourselves, apocalypse. The other is mutual trust. And I've thought a lot about that from the time I read that letter in 1979 at the Regents. And I think about that. And the element that I find here is to break the chain of escalation. You have to get to some kind of trust, because the current method is to pile on more threats. Deterrence means I will do this if you do that. And that the iteration and escalation and positive rate of acceleration and change, then it only leads to a world with more weaponry, more danger, and we're seeing that, with 9 nuclear countries. And while things look good with Gorbachev and Reagan, nevertheless, we couldn't break the addiction because Reagan wanted to keep the SDI research going. So here we are. And I don't know how we ever talked to Putin. And I just heard a talk. I was on the NTI board meeting by Zoom today. And the report there on the relationship, Admiral Mullen told about his relationship. The hostility with China, it's very strong. There's whether you say it's all Xi's fault or you say it's more interactive, like I would think, we're headed to that apocalypse, in my view. And I do know that this is not the general view. I have more of a kind of a doomsday mind, I suppose, based on my seminary days and also my training in the classics, Greek tragedy that I studied as a student. Anyway, Perry always thought that the problem is going to be not this bolt out of the blue, but mistake, false warning, and then a reaction, and there we go. Well, when I was governor, my chief of staff said, "You, Brown, Governor, you're talking too much about nuclear weapons. I want you to talk to General Powell and see what he thinks." So we arranged the call. I spent about 15 minutes with General Powell, and we went over all the scenarios. Could there be a blunder? Could the Russians have a false alert and then respond? What about the Pakistanis, the Indians? Went through not all, but a number of scenarios. And through all of them, General Powell said, "Don't worry, deterrence holds. The control by the Pakistani military is very good. Not as good in India, but it's pretty good." So at the end, he said, "I thank you very much, General Powell. It's been very enlightening." And I immediately called Bill Perry. I said, "Bill, let me tell you, General Powell is not worried." Bill Perry said one thing: Perry is worried. So I think I'll stop at that.
Thank you very much, Governor. I think there's so much that you raised here that, Sig and I would be, I think, tempted to address many of these points. I mean, I'm going to give Sig a chance to respond briefly, but I think perhaps the most important thing of the many important things that you mentioned was the significance of the political relationship, regardless of the technologies that are involved. And I think that's where today we have to be tremendously concerned, because what we do see now on the part of at least advisors to Mr. Putin, making the case that while the Reagan-Gorbachev principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought may have made sense in the past, that it no longer is relevant today. And I think if that, in fact, is the thinking that is shared by the more senior people, and Mr. Putin in particular, then the deterrent effects of nuclear weapons should give us pause. But I don't know, I know, Sig, you want to respond, and I'm afraid that we may have a two or a three-way conversation, and while that might be entertaining, I'm not sure that it's the dialogue that I want at this moment. So I'm going to give you a chance to respond.
Okay, I'll make it very, very brief.
Okay.
First of all, Governor, you're absolutely right. During Jimmy Carter days, Jimmy Carter very badly wanted a comprehensive test ban. And when he called in the directors, I recently read over the entire record of that discussion, and there are several things that impressed me. One was Jimmy Carter's knowledge of the nuclear world. He has such good questions, and I was really impressed by that. But then he was a nuclear engineer by training. And Harold Agnew, he was number 3 director at Los Alamos, and he's said to have killed the idea of a comprehensive test ban. And if you really look at the words, he didn't really kill it, but clearly he and the other 2 lab directors, actually it was only other one, it was Livermore, Roger Batesel, they were not in favor of the test ban. And so they helped to postpone the day of the comprehensive test ban treaty. But next time we meet, I can give you the whole lowdown of, I was director during that whole time when the comprehensive test ban treaty was resurrected. And I went through all of that, and I had to go. I didn't see the president, but I saw General Shalikashvili, who was there. He says, on behalf of President Clinton, let me ask you, Dr. Hecker, do we have to test nuclear weapons in order, to ensure the safety and the effectiveness of nuclear weapons? And what I said, from my standpoint, we'd have loved to have done a few more tests, there's no question. But from what I said, no, I cannot say that we have to do more tests at this point. However, I can also not tell you they're going to last forever, so you better ask me every year. And that's how the annual certification came. But we'll discuss that in more detail. The rest of your comments, of course, the only thing I can say, look, we all share the burden of the fact that we have this nuclear capability out there, and then we all find different ways of how to deal with that. And the way I've personally, found the way to deal with that is what I really worried about is make sure we have no use of nuclear weapons, no proliferation, no nuclear terrorism, and that we actually take advantage of all the best that the nuclear business can give us, the energy. And so that's what I try to do. So I'm not after abolition at this point. I'm after avoiding all of those and getting the best. But we all have our own things. So Bill, back to you.
Okay, I see Abner, and I also want to encourage our students. So good. We have okay, we've got a lot. Okay, I see 3 more after you, Abner. So I think I'm going to collect a few of these questions, if that's okay.
Yep.
Sig, just given the time constraints, and then we'll respond at least to the 4 questions that we have here. Go ahead, Abner.
Thank you, Bill. Number of issues, number of footnotes, but I think I want to start with the important issue, the issue that Governor Brown raised. And my view, which is very much my spirit with the government comment, is how much those 70 years of adventures with the bomb, with the nuclear voyage that we, humanity, have done, how much of that is being marked by what some recent scholar, the late Marty Sherwin, and even our own Benoit, talks about as luck. We have really fortunate to have a great deal of luck. This misguided idea of deterrence, which now, by the way, in the context of what's going on between Iran and Israel, we see how it's so easily misguided, so much arrogance, so much misunderstanding, so much lack of calculations and mistakes. And that luck was not only by the fact that we have avoided in 1963, Cuban crisis, it could have been very, very close, 1962, very, very, very close, and also 1983. But also the question that Eric Schlosser has developed in great details, the luck that no accident actually happened and fully detonated. And we were so close to that number of times. So yes, the number of actual mortalities have went down, but we have made a tango with a great deal of luck, and that we should recall it. And the fact that we gave this legitimacy to that luck is something that we should keep in mind. And the question is, again, in line with what Governor Brown has mentioned, is for how long we would like to continue with that kind of dance with luck. So that's a broad thing.
Evan, let's stop there.
Okay.
And let me then take the other 2 questions on my right, and then we'll turn to the left here. But I want to get the questions before we respond, because otherwise we're not going to, we're going to have to adjourn before we get answers to those. See,
Okay, no.
I'm making a note of all of the questions.
I will. I just want to respond very.
I know, but I would prefer that we take the questions, and then I promise you an opportunity. Please.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Yumi, and I'm from Japan. And I saw this movie last year in Europe, so I could see it. But like recently, that in my country, Japan, was firstly published this movie. So it's very like hot news, and many people like reacted. And I'm interested in the relationship with the scientists and the war, or the development of the nuclear weapons. And so like in the movie, there's a scene that Oppenheimer and other scientists saw the like the Hiroshima or Nagasaki's the scenes or the movies from the American armies. And I saw that especially the Oppenheimer was regretted of this weapons using. But I heard in fact, in reality, the Oppenheimer didn't join the Russell-Einstein this manifesto or the Pugwash conferences. So he was against to the hydrogen weapons, but for the atomic bomb, he didn't so against. He wasn't so against, I guess. But like in 2023, last year, this Oppenheimer movie was published, and this is after the war and after the Cold War. So like I expect that the U.S. government or no U.S. citizens or U.S. The public opinion has changed from the time of the 1945. So that's why Oppenheimer, the scene of Oppenheimer, that regret to the using the nuclear weapons, was depicted in the movie. So is this my understanding correct?
Thank you very much. We'll take two more questions and then Dr. Hecker will have the opportunity to respond. Please, if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'd like to sort of.
Could you identify yourself for the?
Oh, yes. I'm Max Patterson, MPTS here at the Institute. So I'd like to combine some of the topics that we had touched on briefly. The public advocacy, but then also the private advocacy of the directors. I and other scientists affiliated with the labs. For this comprehensive test ban treaty, but then also back to the partial test ban treaty. And actually, we had discussed talking about Edward Teller. I'd like to talk a little bit about, I wonder if there's any comment about his very public advocacy against the partial test ban treaty, and sort of what that means for the way we think about Teller.
Okay, thank you very much. And last, before I turn the floor over to Dr. Hecker, Ali, you want to introduce yourself and ask a question?
Thank you, Dr. Hecker. I'm Ali from the NPTS program. So you are perhaps the most important North Korea watcher. So I was just reading this article yesterday on nuclear latency of South Korea. So my brief question with reference to that is that a country like South Korea, which has a sizable civilian nuclear infrastructure, how much bargaining advantage can it derive from the US by threatening to proliferate to the nuclear level? Because last year, the South Korean president categorically said we like to develop nuclear weapons, although he backtracked.
Thank you, Ali. And I should say, just for your information, I see I don't know whether it's the Consul General or his staff, but we have an ambassador from South Korea on the line here, who's now based in San Francisco. So I just call that to your attention, Ambassador Lim, and his staff may well be on the line here. So, okay, so you have four, important questions here. So I leave it to you to respond as you see fit. You want to start with luck?
Yeah, that's good. So luck is an important part of all of that. But I don't like to focus on the luck by itself because it took a lot more. And so many of the things that were done during those decades, including by the US and even sort of a hostile Soviet Union, were important things to do in the direction of avoiding the use of nuclear weapons. But when you've done all of those, and certainly with the history that we've gone through, it took luck in many of the places. But I don't want to leave the future to luck alone. And so that's what I work on. I'll let you work on the luck part. I'm going to work on the other part where we have something that we can change, something that we can do, the collaboration, the understanding of each other. Like right now, I think one of the big issues will be how do we work with China under these circumstances, and how do we not let things get out of control with China. So yes, of course, you're right, but it's not the only thing. Let's see. I didn't quite understand
Yeah.
I fully appreciate your comment. Essentially, was it the essence that the scientists seem to be too eager to use nuclear weapons and that you're worried about that?
No, yeah.
There was the one, I don't know as I understood the question, there was this one scene where the community of scientists is responding, enthusiastically.
Okay,
to
that
comment.
did not happen. That was a Christopher Nolan invention. There are none of my colleagues who were at Los Alamos or anybody else that I know that actually knows that particular scene happened. And so that was, I mean, the fact that there must have been some celebration, the fact that certainly after Trinity there was. Let me just give you an example. I can't talk for any of them, but I can speak for me, okay? And so speak for me in a very similar question. So here we are in 1995. All right, it's the 50th anniversary of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, First Trinity. I'm director at the laboratory at the time. So here's July 16th, and I had a habit of writing a monthly article for our news bulletin. I call it the inside story, to give employees an idea of what the director thinks about and what like a little bit like the rest of the story. So here comes Trinity and the first test, 50th anniversary, and I wrote a story. And I wrote a story like it must have been. We're proud. It worked. We did all of that. So you celebrate that. Then, that was July. Then for August, I have to write a story about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I said to myself, how can you celebrate that? What are you doing? So I had precisely your problem. And so what I did is I wrote a story that said, asking this question, was it right? Because that was the question that was used. And I said, that's not the right question. I don't know if it was right. I can't put myself back 50 years. But the real question that I want to make sure we can answer, did we learn? Did we learn from that? And 50 years later, we had not used atomic bombs again. And so my view was, yes, we learned from it. And so all the individuals that work in the nuclear business, you have some like Edward Teller and others who are just hardcore conservatives, just like a lot of the political spectrum of this and any other country. And then many others, are much more over on the liberal side. So my own view of that, again, is I didn't go to Los Alamos to build bombs. I mean, that's not what I wanted to do. I went to Los Alamos because of one of the best scientific laboratories in the whole wide world, and that's what I wanted to do. And then eventually, though, as I had to grow, including taking the position of directorship, which I never had any intention to doing, but in the end I did. Then by that time, I sort of viewed that, hey, look, I've never served in the Army. I managed to get a draft to the Vietnam era. This is my time to serve my country. And so that's the way I viewed it. But they all individual reactions, scientists just like any other people, even the scientists working on the bomb are like any other people. Okay, then let's see.
Max asked a question also about Teller's perspective. I don't know if there's so much.
Yeah. So on that one, on the LT. So let me just tell you. So on the limited or partial test ban treaty, 1963. For I think most of this audience knows, but that's when the treaty was signed to limit testing only underground, as you well know, not in the ocean, not in the atmosphere, not in space. And the director of Los Alamos National Laboratory, Middlebury, number 2, he went and he actually advocated in favor of that treaty, okay, because he felt, and of course that was the time when the concerns among the public and the scientists was really major of spewing, this radioactive stuff through these atmospheric explosion, particularly, in the northern hemisphere, and the French did some in the Pacific as well. So Edward Teller, he had very different views, whether it's the Harvard bomb, whether it was this, and so he viewed, the Soviets as such enemies that almost anything came. And of course, if you look at his history, at that time it was Hitler. He was able to escape from Germany. So at any rate, let me leave it at that. As far as the question about South Korea, so I wrote an article. We can talk later, and I'll make sure you get that article. And essentially, it said that's the dumbest thing that the South Koreans can do. You know, the South Koreans, compared to the North, they were so smart. The North decided to build bombs, and its people are starving. The South Koreans decided to do Hyundais, Kias, Samsungs, and all those. And so they put their effort into the commercial arena and did not get sidetracked. Can they build a bomb? Of course they can build a bomb. Do they need the help of the United States? They do not need the help of the United States. But first of all, it will make the Korean Peninsula more dangerous. And that's why, in my opinion, the American government will go a long way to resist South Korea going nuclear. It'll make the Korean Peninsula more dangerous because now you got two leaders who have no experience, and often they're also going to be depending on luck, and their luck will be really important. And I certainly want these two inexperienced leaders having the capabilities to destroy each other. So it'll make the place more dangerous. They don't need it. And you can't just, the thing is, if you're going to do this seriously, you have to do it seriously. You can't just build one bomb. You have to build an arsenal. To build an arsenal takes a national commitment. And that's not what South Korea should do, in my opinion. So it would be a big mistake.
Okay, we have maybe 2 minutes before we have to conclude our session today. I think what I would suggest here, Sig, if you have any kind of closing remarks here. I mean, you put out so many questions on the table, and I think rather than my raising anything else kind of specific, that it probably makes sense for us to have a discussion with you when you come back for your next visit. Maybe Governor Brown will come and join us, and we can kind of have more time to.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to take a look at this.
It's what? Oh, the other one.
So I also have this story, but I didn't get to it. That was one of the other rest of the story ideas. I was on something where Abner was there also, and there was the question raised of what, did other countries have Oppenheimers? And so I dealt with all the countries that have declared nuclear weapons programs. I've been to all of those countries. I've talked to their nuclear folks. And so I know something of that. But in the end, as Avner said, and whatever that one particular discussion was, no, there were no other specific Oppenheimers, because that's when the whole concept had to be developed. They had to have, the proof of it works. And Avner, I would add the other thing, and they had one tight timeline. I mean, that's also the difference. They knew they had to do this really, really fast. And they did. But the other ones are fascinating. Someday I'll talk more about the Russians, because the Russian Oppenheimer I met several times. And the Russian Oppenheimer, I actually had invited him to come to Los Alamos in 1995 to give the Oppenheimer lecture. Okay, and he was too ill to come. He didn't come to the lecture, but he wrote a lecture for us. And it's a moral triumph as far as I'm concerned. I can share that with you later. I'll leave it there.
Okay. Sig, thanks so much. This was fascinating. I wish we had more time. We'll have you back for a continuing discussion on these and other issues. So I ask our audience to please join me in expressing our great appreciation for your excellent seminar here.
Thank you.